Welcome to our fourth day and our final keynote speaker of the OFI workshop on highly dynamic ecosystems and changing reference points. Today we have our speaker from Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Dr. Robyn Forrest, who will be talking about challenges for providing science advice under changing productivity. Dr. Forrest is a research scientist at DFO in Nanaimo, British Columbia, in the Quantitative Methods section at the Pacific Biological Station. Robyn has a BA in Theatre Arts from Curtin University in Western Australia, a BSc in Marine Science from the University of Sydney, and a PhD from the University of British Columbia. Her main research interests include management strategy evaluation, implementation of ecosystem-based management, fisheries reference points, and sustainable management for data-limited species, and testing the performance of fisheries management systems. Robyn is the newly appointed chair of DFO's Committee on Technical Expertise and Stock Assessment, also known as TESA, that organizes topical workshops and training courses for the department. She's also a Canadian alternate member on the ICES Advisory Committee. She's worked extensively on several Canadian domestic stocks and their assessment, as well as transboundary stocks with the International Pacific Halibut Commission and with NOAA on Pacific hake. So Robyn, with that introduction, we will pass the floor to you. Thanks.
Thank you for the invitation. And it's really great to be here. I've really been enjoying the first days of the workshop. And I think you'll agree the first three keynote presentations were really interesting and spurred a lot of really great discussion. And I hope today that I can offer a slightly Canadian perspective and maybe underscore some of the points that we've heard from the previous presentations. And I mostly work on Pacific groundfish and mostly on quite data limited species. So that there is a slant towards those species and data limitations in this talk. So I'll start by giving some Canadian context. In 2019, Canada underwent a major change of its Fisheries Act, which I think has spurred some of the reasons for this meeting today. And fish stocks of most importance, I think, to those of us working on stock assessment are the fish stocks provisions, which state that in the management of fisheries, the minister now has to take into account the environmental conditions affecting the stock when making management decisions. This includes ensuring that stocks are managed at a level that promotes the sustainability of the stock. It includes setting a limit reference point, which also must take into account the environmental conditions, and also requires the definition of rebuilding plans within 2 years if a stock is assessed to be below the limit reference point. So this is the first time we've had a legal requirement in Canada to take environmental conditions into account when we're making fisheries management decisions. So this has obviously spurred a lot of work and a lot of resources at the department. And a lot of this work is being led through a National Fisheries Science Working Group being led by Julie Marantet and recently by Rob Cronland before he retired. And largely the fish stocks provisions are being interpreted through DFO's precautionary approach framework and the sustainable fisheries framework. So those of you working for DFO, this image is burned in your brain. This is the Canada's precautionary approach framework diagram, and it defines 3 reference points for the management of fisheries. A limit reference point, which delineates a critical zone from a cautious zone, an upper stock reference, which delineates a cautious zone from a healthy zone, and a removal reference, which defines the maximum removal rate. Interestingly, Canada doesn't define an overfishing threshold. Sustainability is largely measured and tracked via a sustainability survey, which reports which zones these stocks are in. But we currently don't have any national guidance on how to account for changing environmental conditions in determining reference points. So as part of the national initiatives to implement the fish stock provisions, The National Ecosystem Approach to Fisheries Management Framework has been formed. This is being led nationally by Pierre Pepin, who has been at this meeting and will be able to speak more fully to that. But the objective of the EAFM working group is to apply an ecosystem approach to fisheries management in Canada by ensuring that all stocks consider environmental variables in advice. And a review that they undertook in 2019 found that currently fewer than 25% of stock assessments in Canada consider environmental variables in the delivery of advice. So the strategy of this national EAFM working group is via case studies across the country, looking at different ways for accounting for environmental variables in advice. And the key thing here is that all of these case studies are single species focused, with the idea that we try to work on single species systems that we understand more fully before moving to the more idealized ecosystem-based fisheries management and multi-species approaches. So the main aim for the working group is to be incremental, pragmatic, and aiming towards a transparent framework. So I mentioned the case studies. So I mentioned the case studies. So I really want to just point out that there are a large number. Sorry. Zoom fail. Sorry about that. So I just really want to point out that there are a large number of case studies across Canada, and that many of the PIs on these case studies are here at this meeting. And I really hope in the discussion following this talk and tomorrow and in the subsequent workshop that follows this one, that we hear from these PIs from these other case studies. I'm involved in just one case study, Haida Gwaii herring, which I'll touch on a little bit towards the end of the talk. I also want to give a shout out to Pacific salmon. As Andre mentioned on Monday, Pacific salmon scientists have been thinking about time varying productivity and environmental variables for decades. And we hear it, in the Pacific region, we often hear people talking about the salmon world. We do this in the salmon world, this happens in the salmon world. And I always wonder, don't we all live in the same world? But I think when it comes to thinking about these problems, we actually do live in different worlds. And we have a lot to learn from the salmon world for those of us working on other species. So I won't be speaking more about salmon at this meeting, but I hope that in subsequent meetings in the discussion, we can talk about salmon as well. So I'll just start with a brief definition of the productivity of fish populations. This is defined as the capacity of a population to produce biomass. So I really like this description because it's succinct. I don't think you can be more clear about it, and it's also made in Newfoundland by Joanne Morgan, Peter Shelton, and in this paper. So the capacity of a population to produce biomass, resulting from increases due to growth and reproduction, and countered by declines due to mortality. And it determines the level of fishing that can be sustained without a decline in population size. So we know that, we've been hearing about that. And we've been hearing as well that productivity and these methods that link productivity with population size have largely been determined by equilibrium methods and assumptions of stationarity. So how do we account for time varying productivity and reference points? Like many of you, I'm really just starting out on this journey as well. So I've started with the literature, and we've really come across two main approaches. Although there are many others apart from these, but the main ones I think are, the first one is to intrinsically integrate environmental variables that are changing into the stock assessment. So allow productivity parameters to change and therefore reference points. And I think this is really what this meeting is about. But there are the other approach that I've come across, and the reason I'm mentioning it is because a framework for this has been developed in Canada already, is to add buffers to the removal rate to allow for greater uncertainty when environmental conditions are known to be changing. And this is based on ideas of risk equivalency, largely developed in Australia. And this involves a post hoc adjustment of the harvest control rule. This report has come out, suggested framework. It's very detailed on some of the methods. It can be based on qualitative or quantitative assessments of how environmental variability affects productivity, and by the authors Dan Duplessis, Marie-Julie Roux, Karen Hunter and Jake Rice, all of whom I believe are at this meeting. And so I won't be speaking more about that, but those authors can speak to the post hoc approach. So for the rest of the talk, I want to highlight 4 main points. So if you wonder where I'm going with a case study, just come back to these 4 points and I'll try and get to the points at the end. And the first is that change is happening. So in the Pacific region, we know that change is happening. These plots were made by my colleague, a postdoc at the Pacific Biological Station, Felina English. The plot on the left shows decadal changes in bottom temperature off the coast of British Columbia for the decade 2008 to 2018. So we know we had a very severe warming event towards the end of this period, and we can see that, especially in shallower areas, there's been quite a trend in warming in water. We also know that this is affecting species density. Felina's been doing a really fascinating study, a spatiotemporal analysis of biotic velocities. This is the plot on the right is an example for tiger rockfish, showing over a decade subtle shifts in density from warmer areas to cooler areas. And she's shown across 38 species that fine-scale local shifts in density are occurring, and that these are occurring more in places with greater warming. We're also seeing trends across the world in other species, such as top predators. This is work by Peter Olisiak. It's pulling together of rookery data for stellar sea lions in British Columbia since 1910. And in the North Pacific and the North Atlantic, we have seen these large increases in top predators in our ecosystems. We might also expect, under changing environmental conditions, more extreme events. This is Boccaccio rockfish, which was listed by the Committee on Status of Endangered Species in Canada as endangered, and has had a very low quota in BC for many years. In 2018, there was an absolutely giant recruitment event, and these are the log recruitment deviations. And I'd say again, these are log recruitment deviations. And these fish that are, appeared everywhere. We had reports of little rockfish everywhere from all kinds of sources. These are now starting to enter the trawl fishery, and they are becoming a problem. They are actually becoming a choke species because they have a low quota, and they're affecting the ability of the trawl fishery to prosecute other species. So with events like this, we have to be more nimble in our management to large unexpected events in the future, and also in our modeling. We might need to think about other ways to model things such as recruitment that allow for the possibility of these large events. So we know change is happening, but we're facing challenges as to how we integrate this information into stock assessment advice. Many of our stocks in Canada, especially in the Pacific region, are data limited. Clear mechanisms linking environmental variables and productivity are not well understood for most species. I think in Canada, we've got some very clear examples of links between mortality, for example, in grey seals and Atlantic cod, but we're not there yet with many of our species on the West Coast. And while there have been many studies on this and on how environmental variables interact with productivity, and there's starting to be more and more, we don't yet have a framework for incorporating this information into stock assessment advice. And I would point as well, somebody mentioned inertia in the discussion yesterday. Incorporating environmental variables has not been a pressure on fisheries management, and really that's where our work planning comes from through the requests for science advice. So it hasn't been prioritized in the past for stock assessment. And I really appreciated Jason's comment yesterday that really you just have to start doing this stuff for a while before there's actually uptake. So that's my those are my points on changes happening. As I'm just going to go into a little case study here. To make my second point is we don't always need to know the dynamics to make a decision. So this is a Hecate Strait Pacific cod. It's considered a data moderate stock. Its indices of abundance are not very informative. This species is at the southern end of its range in British Columbia. So in many ways, biologically, it doesn't behave in the same way as stocks in Alaska might. It's incredibly difficult to age. It has very high plasticity and growth, and so we don't have any production aging, and we don't really have any reliable composition data for assessing this stock. So it's assessed using a delay difference model. This is the latest biomass estimates from the most recent assessment. And we can see we've got these interesting cyclical dynamics. These are largely driven by the catch data and the catch per unit effort data. For the historical period, but we have what apparently is a large cyclic period followed by a decline and then an apparent change in productivity or biomass. And I'll just note as well that these big green and red stripes are the reference points, and the reason that the confidence intervals are so broad is that for Pacific cod at least, they're based on estimated historical biomass and not on BMSY. So in Canada, we're not required to base our reference points on BMSY. And in this case, we've been using historical, which were agreed upon by industry managers and scientists. So the stock assessment explains that period of low biomass since 1990 on below average recruitment for most years since 1991. But to really, I think, understand what the stock assessment model is doing and what the biomass is doing is to understand some of the changes in the management history of this species, which have been large. So in the historical period prior to 1990, there were no TACs on this species. And the industry tell us that really they fished to abundance. So when there was a lot of cod out there, they caught cod. When they weren't, they caught something else. In 1992, following concerns of rockfish bycatch in the groundfish trawl fishery, some major management changes started to be implemented. This started with the introduction of individual transferable quotas in 92, followed by 100% at sea observer coverage in 1996. And this has really changed the way the fishery has been prosecuted since then. Also, in 2002, following some years of low abundance, the fishery was closed. It was reopened in 2003 with low TACs, and the TACs have been fairly low ever since. So I think a lot of what we're seeing in those low catches is actually being driven by management changes and changes in behavior of the fishery. Pacific cod's no longer as important a target species as it once was either. So this might look like a regime shift, but in this case, we don't think it is a regime shift, although we don't really know. And I think Neil Clare, in his great paper on regime shifts, warned about detecting a regime shift that might actually be the result of changing selectivity or some other external force. And this is a pity, really, because we used to have this really fantastic correlation between Prince Rupert sea level and recruitment in Pacific cod. This was first looked at in 1986. If you haven't seen this report, it's really fantastic. It's got a lot of great papers in there. You probably can't read the title, but it was the Symposium on Biological Interactions in the North Pacific region and Factors Affecting Recruitment, Distribution and Abundance of Non-Anadromous Fisheries. There's a lot of really famous authors in there, a lot of really interesting work. But we used to have this correlation. Prince Rupert sea level is thought to be proxy for northward transport of larvae outside of the Hecate Strait, and so there was a negative correlation between sea level and recruitment. But our analyses in more recent years, this was a dominant hypothesis until the mid-2000s, but more recent analyses, we cannot detect that anymore. And we don't know if it's because the relationship has broken down or because of those problems with the recruitment time series that I mentioned. So there was another hypothesis put forward by Dave Fournier even earlier than that in 1983, which looked at depensatory natural mortality in adult fish as a driver of cyclic dynamics in Pacific cod. So I won't bore you with an equation, but just to illustrate how you model density-dependent mortality. Basically, we have a simple two-parameter equation, two parameters M0 and M1, and natural mortality varies as a function of the depletion of the stock. So in the red, we have depensation. As the stock size decreases, mortality increases. That's the bad kind of density-dependent mortality, because as your stock gets smaller, your mortality increases, and this is how stocks can get trapped in low biomass, for example, through LE effects. And then in the green at the bottom here, we have compensation, which is the more commonly encountered population regulation mechanism, where natural mortality decreases as the population decreases as a result of changes in competition, for example, less competition for food and habitat. So of course, density dependence also affects reference points. These plots show fishing mortality, equilibrium fishing mortality versus equilibrium natural mortality, biomass and yield. This is from a paper we published in 2018. So in the depensatory case, as fishing mortality increases, so does our natural mortality. And under depensation, our equilibrium spawning biomass is smaller, our MSY is also lower, and our FMSY is also lower. So it matters to decision making, possibly, that if density dependence is occurring, and especially if it's depensatory density dependence, that we try to account for it. So with this in mind, we wanted this is with Kendra Holt and Rob Carnland, we were interested in the performance of harvest control rules that we were using for evaluating Pacific cod. And we wanted to, so we had these 5 harvest control rules based on MSY, SPR40, historical, such as the ones I just showed you, 2 based on B0. Obviously with, and here you can see in the diagram with different inflection points on the harvest control rule, some more precautionary, some less so. And we wanted to know how these would perform under 2 different assumptions about natural mortality. So we constructed 2 operating models, one with a constant mortality and one with a depensatory mortality, and conducted a closed loop simulation exercise, or as we heard yesterday, a desktop MSE exercise. And I will just say here that sometimes I think when you say that you're going to do management strategy evaluation, what people hear is we don't have to care about the dynamics. We just find a harvest control rule management procedure that works under whatever dynamics, and we don't really need to know the dynamics. I don't think that's true. I think we have to take a lot of care in how we construct our operating models. And so where we put our uncertainty about changing natural mortality is in our operating models. And Andre gave us some very good guidance on Monday as to things to consider when considering plausibility of operating models. So we have a closed loop simulation exercise, 2 operating models, 5 harvest control rules. This is a radar plot showing the performance of those 5 harvest control rules under the constant M. And people love these plots or hate them, but the point is that on each vertex of the plot, we have a performance metric. Down here we have the probability that the stock is above the limit reference point over the long term. And then 2 performance metrics here based around catch and 2 more based around stock status. And what all this plot is really showing us is that the historical reference point, the one we're using, has the best performance in terms of the probability of keeping the stock above the limit reference point over the long term, with very large trade-offs in terms of variability in catch and average catch. And within there, we can see the performance of the others. And this is a way to present to managers and stakeholders the trade-offs associated with various management procedures that we might want to use. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that this radar plot looks very similar under both scenarios of constant M and depensatory M. So we're going to make the same decision in terms of choosing a harvest control rule, regardless of the dynamics. So that's my point, that we can make a decision without explicit knowledge of the true underlying dynamics of the reference point. So the nature of the advice that we would give in this case would be less the stock is in the critical zone. It would be more, we've chosen a management procedure that provides a high probability of keeping the stock out of the critical zone. So it's a subtle distinction. So my third point is that changing reference points changes objectives, and Dan just put up that plot showing that Jason showed yesterday about moving the goalposts. And so I just want to make just a little point here that this is something that we need to think about as we think about changing reference points. As I mentioned, I'm starting out on this journey like many of you in reference points, and so I would recommend these papers where I've been starting to get my to learn about dynamic reference points, the performance of reference points. Many of them came out of Andre's lab, 2 particularly good papers. So this one here by Cecilia O'Leary and Aaron Berger, which I think are a really great place to start if you want to just learn about the nuts and bolts of dynamic reference points. So I've been working a little bit with Tom Carruthers and his team at Blue Matter Science. They're the developers of DLM Tool and MSE Tool. And there's really three ways to think about B0. The first is historical, which would represent, it's a static representation of B0. It represents the state of the biomass in year 1. So we might not use this in our stock assessments very much, but it is a benchmark, and it is in a lot of people's minds how they think, the benchmark to which they think the stock would recover if fishing was stopped. And it's really an important part in this idea of the shifting baseline syndrome. That, you know, a lot of people think that we should be able to return to a past period of productivity. Secondly, something that, you know, Tom calls asymptotic B0. This is an equilibrium concept. I think in Aaron's paper, he referred to it as static B0. And this is what I think we're used to using in our stock assessments, where it's an equilibrium B0 that's calculated using the contemporary parameter estimates or the average over a window of years. And then finally, we have a dynamic B0, which I think is why many of us are here, and what there's a lot of interest in this. I think it's been used widely in the tuna world, but not so much for other fisheries. And in this case, in each year, T, the model is rerun from T1 to TT without fishing. And again, there can be averaging over a window of years. And what's nice about dynamic B0, as Aaron Berger points out in his paper, is that it allows you to see the differences between natural causes of change in the stock and those changes attributed to fishing. So in this figure from his paper, the red line represents the dynamic B0 and the black line represents the biomass under fishing. So if you can make the assumption that all of the underlying stock dynamics are independent of fishing, you can make statements about what the effects of fishing have been historically. So I'm going to present some very preliminary unpublished work on the explorations that Tom and I have been doing on dynamic reference points for Haida-Gwaii Pacific herring, and just to make one point really. So Haida-Gwaii Pacific herring is a depleted stock. It's assessed to be in the critical zone. Currently, a rebuilding plan is being developed for this stock. And between 1980 and the late 1990s, the stock underwent a large decline. And this was in 97 and 98, accompanied by a precipitous drop in surplus production of the stock, and then a rapid move to a low productivity and low biomass state. And completely in the absence of fishing. These little black bars here represent the catch. And so there's been no fishery for this stock really since 2000, and it hasn't recovered. So something has changed in the productivity of this stock. And so there's various avenues being explored in terms of what might be driving this productivity, and also in how we account for time varying productivity in decision making for this stock. So Tom and I have just been hypothetically exploring some future M scenarios that could be, for example, related to marine mammal abundance. So two scenarios, one with a large increase in natural mortality, and one with more of a drop in and a stability in natural mortality. So looking at our B0 in three ways. Again, this is with no future fishing. So this is the most optimistic, again, well, not optimistic, but this is the least human perturbance of the stock. So this is these are our three B0s. So the first one is the straight line. The orange line is the asymptotic B0, historical static B0, and then the dashed purple line is the asymptotic B0. And then down here we have the spawning biomass in the green and the dynamic B0 in the pink. And we can see obviously that they have converged because there is no fishery on the stock. The B0 and the dynamic B0 and the spawning biomass are essentially the same series. For the increasing M scenario, we see then that the asymptotic B0 starts to go down as well because natural mortality is increasing. No change in the historic B0, and the dynamic B0 is obviously the same. So if we look at that in terms of a performance metric, and I'm just throwing this up as an example of a fairly extreme case of a stock that is very, very depleted and under high future fishing mortality scenarios will continue to be depleted, and with a no fishing scenario. So if at the end of this period we evaluate the probability that the stock is above the limit reference point of 0.3 B0, then we see something that we might expect to see. We see as the stock declines, especially under the increasing M scenario, we see an increasingly lower probability that the stock is above the limit reference point. And I think, and when we use the asymptotic B0, which is our status quo, we see something similar. We expect that as the stock declines, that our probability of being above a limit reference point will also decline. Well, you can see this coming, obviously, because the B0 and the biomass are the same time series now in the absence of fishing, that when you use the dynamic B0 as a benchmark for rebuilding, then there's a 100% probability that the stock is rebuilt, because, and technically it's true because the stock's in a new productivity regime, but it might not be what people are expecting. And so it's very important, I think, to work through some of these types of exercises to make sure that we really understand some of the implications or the messaging about the use of changing reference points as benchmarks for rebuilding. and what it really means to be rebuilt. So that was just a little example. My last point is there are tools to help guide decisions and communication, especially in data-limited cases. And these are the best practices for management strategy evaluation. Excellent paper by Andre et al. In 2016. We've used this paper extensively to guide our thinking and our work in designing a framework for managing data-limited species. 6 steps. The first actually isn't in Andre's paper, but it was picked up from a book by Gregory et al. By Sean Cox and Ashleen Benson when they were developing a roadmap for a management strategy evaluation for Pacific herring. But the first step should always be define the decision context. And defining the decision context is an important step for any decision-making process, including management strategy evaluation. But it's where you define the scope of the project, how decisions are going to get made, who's involved, who makes the decision, the roles and responsibilities of the various actors. And importantly, provides a framework for the rest of the decision-making process. And secondly, the selection of objectives and performance metrics is also a really important component of the decision-making cycle. And of course, all of these steps of the MSE process are iterative. And the really nice thing about performing closed-loop simulation exercises is that as we start to learn about various implications of what we're trying to do, we can iteratively update our objectives. And certainly in many MSE processes, it can take many years to refine a set of objectives. So this is not just the realm of science, this is the realm of managers, stakeholders, First Nations, and really there needs to be everybody at the table in that defining the decision context step. So for Pacific groundfish, this is work led by Sean Anderson, and the Science Advisory Report has just come out. We, over the last 2 years, developed a framework for giving advice for data-limited species in the Pacific region, with the idea to facilitate decision-making compliant with precautionary approach policy and fish stocks provisions, provide the means by which we can identify management procedures with a high probability of exceeding a reference point, even if we can't directly report the stock status. And also, Sean has developed a large number of visualization tools for visualizing trade-offs for this objective and others, whilst also accounting for uncertainty. And this framework we've been using the DLM tool, MSE tool, SAM tool, R packages developed by Tom Carruthers and his team. The framework is software agnostic, but we have really enjoyed using these tools. We have a large partnership with Tom's company to keep developing these tools. DFO funds a full-time person and who has developed a MSE tool and SAM tool, which is not related to SAM that is used in ICES. It just stands for Stock Assessment Model. But anyway, we really we find that these tools are very customizable, very easy to use. And we have a lot of really great support from Tom and his team. And because DFO is funding a large part of this work, any other DFO employees that want to explore the use of these MSE tools can do so. So I'm borrowing a quote here that I think was attributed to Billy Christensen. I don't know if he actually said it, but models are not like religion. You can have more than one. MSE best practice recommends using multiple operating models to explore a wide range of possible population dynamics. And the best practices published by Ponce et al. And also papers by Rademeyer as well. There's a recommendation to develop multiple sets of operating models, one being a reference set of operating models, which includes the most important uncertainties. which are both highly plausible and have a major impact of results. And those papers give a really comprehensive discussion of how you might evaluate plausibility of operating models. And in the robustness set, these models, these operating models are designed to capture a wider range of uncertainties and hypotheses that might be less plausible, but also need to be explored and might have large impacts on outcomes. And so robustness operating models might be a good place to start introducing environmental variables into population dynamics in a way where we can learn about them. And so in the MP framework, we presented reference sets and robustness set performance metrics separately. For the reference set, we average across operating models, while in the robustness set, we present the performance metrics separately for contrast. So this was just a little example for Rexol over a set of data limited management procedures. These two management procedures at the end are the long-term probability of being above the limit reference point and the long-term probability of being above the upper stock reference. And so this is the performance here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but on the left of the left-hand plot, we have the performance under the reference set. But on the right-hand plot, on the two leftmost panels, we see quite different performance over an increasing natural mortality scenario. So that is a good place to look for important dynamics that might be impacting our ability to choose management procedures. So I'll just finish up just by saying the whether, when, and how of changing reference points. Defining the decision context is especially important if considering including environmental considerations. Moving goalposts can have a large impact on our perception of the stock, and it's going to be important to bring people affected by the decisions that we make along. So it is not just, I think, the purview of science to make these decisions, although the scientific analysis is very important. MSc does not absolve us of rigorous data analysis, investigation into alternative drivers of productivity, or development of thoughtful hypotheses. It just sometimes changes where we put those hypotheses. And MSc does provide a framework to test the performance of management procedures under alternative hypotheses and iteratively refine objectives and learn and communicate the benefits and trade-offs of changing reference points. And we can do this in a virtual setting and it can aid communication. Because, you know, as I think we've heard in the previous talks, sometimes it makes a lot of sense to use dynamic reference points. I don't want to suggest that it doesn't. I just think that we need to be really clear in our communication. So as I just said, the whether, when, and how to change reference points, not solely the purview of science. Certainly in the Pacific region, more work is needed to bridge gaps among ecosystem scientists, oceanographers, and fisheries scientists. In the Pacific, Oceanography Institute is 150 kilometers away from Pacific Biological Station, so we do not interact with our oceanographers as perhaps we should. One of the breakout sessions in next week's TESA workshop that Dan mentioned is actually trying to bring oceanographers and fisheries scientists together to talk about how we can more productively work on some of these issues. And of course, we need to bridge gaps amongst scientists, managers, First Nations, and stakeholders. And I really like the IC's working group model, and I think DFO could do more to follow a model like that. And so I would definitely advocate more working groups and more workshops like this. So I'd like to acknowledge Tom, Kwang, and Adrian from Blue Matters Science, who've provided us with so much support using DLM Tool, MSc Tool, and SAM Tool. Also Sean Anderson, Felina English, Kerry Holt, Pierre Papin, Tim Barrett, who I spoke to prior to this meeting, and Dan, Van, and Tyler for inviting me, and the OFI. And with that, I will stop talking and ask if there are any questions. Thank you.